The United States built the most ambitious technology alliance in modern history. It convinced Japan and South Korea, two nations that have been economic rivals for over a century, to join forces against China's semiconductor ambitions. Washington called it a chip alliance. Policy papers described it as an unbreakable trilateral partnership. The White House celebrated it as the future of semiconductor security, and it's already falling apart. Not because of Chinese pressure, not because of diplomatic failures, but because of a fundamental contradiction built into the alliance's own architecture that nobody in Washington wants to talk about. So why is the most powerful technology partnership ever assembled cracking before it even reaches full implementation? And why are the two nations America needs most in this fight quietly undermining the very strategy they publicly agreed to support? Here's the answer, and it's one that challenges everything the mainstream narrative tells you about semiconductor alliances. Japan and South Korea didn't join this alliance because they share America's strategic vision. They joined because each saw an opportunity to advance its own industrial interests at the expense of the other. And the moment those interests collided with the alliance's stated objectives, which happened faster than anyone in Washington predicted, the cracks became structural. Most people think the Chip 4 alliance, which includes the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, is a unified front against Chinese semiconductor development. That's the story you hear from every policy analyst in Washington and every editorial board in the Western press. And here's what that narrative gets fundamentally wrong. It treats four nations with deeply competing commercial interests as though they're a military coalition with a common enemy. They're not. They're four companies forced into the same conference room by a government that controls the rules, each one calculating how to gain advantage while appearing cooperative. To understand why this alliance is structurally failing, you need to understand three forces that are pulling it apart from the inside. I call them the rival's dilemma, the China revenue trap, and the subsidy cannibalization effect. Each one alone would strain any technology partnership. Together, they make the current alliance framework functionally unsustainable. Let me start with the first force, the rival's dilemma, because this is where the foundational contradiction lives. Japan and South Korea are not natural allies. They are historic competitors with unresolved political tensions stretching back to Japanese colonial rule from 1910 to 1945. In 2019, just 5 years before the Chip Alliance was formalized, Japan imposed export controls on three critical semiconductor materials sold to South Korea: hydrogen fluoride, fluorinated polyamide, and photoresist. This wasn't ancient history. This was a direct technology attack by one alliance member against another. Japan restricted these materials because of a diplomatic dispute over wartime labor compensation rulings in South Korean courts. Here's the number that tells you how serious this was. This is $3.86 billion, not about $4 billion. $3.86 billion. That's the estimated impact on South Korea's semiconductor supply chain from Japan's 2019 material restrictions before emergency diversification measures were implemented. Samsung and SK Hynix scrambled to source alternatives. Production schedules were disrupted, and South Korea launched a crash program to develop domestic alternatives for all three materials, a program that is now reducing South Korea's dependency on Japanese suppliers permanently. When I spoke with a semiconductor policy advisor in Seoul last March, he put it bluntly. He said, "Washington asks us to trust Japan as a technology partner, but 3 years before this alliance existed, Japan weaponized its material supply chain against us. That memory doesn't disappear because the Americans organized a photo opportunity." If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because the next part reveals how the China problem makes this rivalry even worse. Here's what matters about the rival's dilemma. It's not just historical resentment. It's active commercial competition happening right now inside the alliance. And the battleground is the one market neither Japan nor South Korea can afford to lose, which is the second force tearing this alliance apart. It's called the China revenue trap, and it explains why both nations are quietly sabotaging the alliance's core objective. Let me show you exactly how. So here's the second force at work, and this one is the reason why every public statement of unity from Tokyo and Seoul should be read with deep skepticism: the China revenue trap. Here's a question that exposes the entire contradiction at the heart of this alliance. How do you convince two nations to restrict technology sales to their single largest customer? The answer is you can't, not sustainably. And the numbers prove it. In 2023, South Korea exported $14.27 billion worth of semiconductor products to China, including Hong Kong. That represented 39.7% of South Korea's total semiconductor exports, not about 40%, exactly 39.7%. China is not just South Korea's biggest chip market, it is South Korea's biggest market for anything. Samsung and SK Hynix derive more revenue from Chinese customers than from American, Japanese, and European customers combined. Japan's exposure is equally significant. In fiscal year 2023, Japanese semiconductor equipment manufacturers exported $9.83 billion to China. Tokyo Electron, Japan's largest chip equipment maker, generated 43.8% of its total revenue from Chinese customers. Screen Holdings generated 37.2%. Advantest generated 34.6%. For these companies, China isn't just important, it is existential. Here's what nobody tells you about how this revenue dependency is actively undermining the alliance. When the United States pressured Japan to restrict exports of 23 categories of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China in July 2023, Tokyo formally complied. The restrictions were announced, the press releases were issued, Washington celebrated. But here's what actually happened in the 12 months following those restrictions. Japanese semiconductor equipment exports to China increased by 11.4%. Not decreased, increased. How? Because the restrictions were written with carve-outs, exceptions, and maintenance service provisions that allowed Japanese companies to continue serving existing Chinese customers while technically complying with the new rules. When I was in Tokyo last November meeting with trade policy analysts at a major Japanese research institute, one senior fellow told me something remarkably candid off the record. He said, "The government wrote the restrictions to satisfy Washington while protecting our companies. Everyone in METI understood that destroying our China revenue would damage Japanese industry more than it would damage Chinese semiconductor development. So the rules were designed to look restrictive while being practically navigable. Stay with me because what comes next changes everything about how you should evaluate this alliance." South Korea has played the same game even more openly. When Washington pushed Seoul to restrict memory chip sales to China, the Korean government negotiated a critical exception. Samsung and SK Hynix operate major fabrication facilities inside China. Samsung runs a NAND flash memory fab in Xi'an. SK Hynix operates DRAM and NAND fabs in Dalian and Wuxi. These facilities require continuous equipment upgrades and technology transfers to remain commercially viable. The Biden administration granted Samsung and SK Hynix indefinite exemptions, allowing them to continue upgrading their Chinese fabs with advanced equipment. This is $52.3 billion. That's the combined estimated value of Samsung's and SK Hynix's Chinese fab operations. Washington couldn't force Seoul to abandon $52.3 billion in fixed assets without triggering a diplomatic crisis with a treaty ally. So the exemptions were granted, and those exemptions effectively created a permanent pipeline through which advanced semiconductor technology continues flowing into China through allied companies that are supposedly part of the restriction framework. If you're finding this valuable, share this with someone who needs to understand what's really happening behind the diplomatic handshakes. If you want to understand the China revenue trap in a single case study, just look at what happened to ASML. The Dutch company isn't formally part of the Chip 4 alliance, but it's the test case for how revenue dependency undermines restriction frameworks. After the Netherlands restricted ASML's most advanced EUV exports to China in 2023, ASML's total China revenue for 2023 actually hit $7.14 billion, representing 29.3% of total company revenue, because Chinese customers accelerated purchases of permitted DUV systems. China became ASML's largest single market for the first time in the company's history in the same year it was supposedly being restricted. Here's what matters about the China revenue trap. It creates a situation where every alliance member has a financial incentive to comply minimally with restrictions while maximizing continued China sales. The alliance's public posture is confrontation, its private behavior is accommodation, and that gap between rhetoric and reality is widening every quarter. And this connects to the third force, the one that is now turning alliance members against each other in a direct competition for American money. It's called the Subsidy Cannibalization Effect, and it reveals the most destructive contradiction of all, because the very subsidies designed to strengthen the alliance are actually accelerating its fracture. The subsidy cannibalization effect is the force that transforms allies into competitors, and here's the uncomfortable truth that makes Washington's entire semiconductor strategy structurally contradictory. The United States is simultaneously asking Japan and South Korea to restrict their most profitable market while competing against them for semiconductor manufacturing investment on American soil. Let me show you what this actually means with numbers that expose the contradiction. The CHIPS and Science Act allocated $52.7 billion in federal subsidies to revitalize American semiconductor manufacturing. The stated goal was to bring cutting-edge chip production back to U.S. soil. But here's what most coverage misses entirely. The primary beneficiaries of CHIPS Act funding aren't American companies. They're the same foreign allies the U.S. is asking to sacrifice China revenue. TSMC received $6.6 billion in grants plus $5 billion in loans to build fabs in Arizona. Samsung received $6.4 billion in grants to expand its facility in Taylor, Texas. SK Hynix received preliminary approval for $458 million to build an advanced packaging facility in Indiana. These subsidies are designed to incentivize allied companies to build manufacturing capacity inside the United States. Here's the problem nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge. Every fab that Samsung builds in Texas is a fab that Samsung doesn't build in South Korea. Every TSMC facility in Arizona is capacity that doesn't go to Kumamoto, Japan, where TSMC is also building with Japanese government subsidies. The alliance members aren't just cooperating, they're competing against each other for the same investment dollars, the same equipment allocations, and the same engineering talent. When I spoke with an industrial policy researcher at the Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade in Seoul last February, she described the dynamic with striking clarity. She said, "The Americans are essentially asking us to move our most advanced manufacturing to their country, using their subsidies while simultaneously restricting our access to our most profitable market." From Seoul's perspective, we're being asked to weaken our own industrial base to strengthen America's. That's not an alliance. That's an extraction. This is the subsidy cannibalization paradox. The money designed to bring allies closer is actually revealing how divergent their interests truly are. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because the numbers I'm about to show you make this contradiction even more stark. Japan has responded to American CHIPS Act subsidies by launching its own competing subsidy program. Tokyo committed $25.3 billion between 2023 and 2025 to domestic semiconductor manufacturing investment. This includes $5.87 billion for Rapidus, a Japanese consortium attempting to build a 2-nanometer fabrication facility in Hokkaido with IBM technology. It includes $341 billion to attract TSMC to build 2 fabs in Kumamoto. And it includes expanded funding for domestic equipment manufacturers to reduce dependency on foreign technology. South Korea escalated even further. In 2024, Seoul announced a $471 billion public-private semiconductor investment plan extending through 2047. This is the largest semiconductor investment commitment by any single nation in history. The plan includes $14.7 billion in direct government subsidies, massive tax incentives, and the creation of a semiconductor megacluster in Yongin housing 5 new fabs. Here's the uncomfortable truth about what this subsidy race means for the alliance. Each nation is now racing to build self-sufficient semiconductor ecosystems that reduce their dependency on each other. The United States wants domestic manufacturing so it doesn't depend on Asian fabs. Japan wants domestic capability so it doesn't depend on American technology or Korean memory. South Korea wants domestic resilience so it doesn't depend on Japanese materials or American political goodwill. The alliance that was supposed to create interdependence is actually accelerating independence. Every subsidy dollar spent in one country is a strategic signal to the others that long-term dependency is considered a vulnerability, not a strength. And here's the number that crystallizes this entire contradiction. This is $694.3 billion. That's the combined total of announced semiconductor subsidies and investment commitments from the United States, Japan, South Korea, and the European Union between 2022 and 2025. $694.3 billion flowing simultaneously into competing domestic semiconductor programs across allied nations, each one designed to reduce that nation's dependency on the others. A former senior Commerce Department official I met at a semiconductor policy forum in San Jose last December captured it perfectly. He said, "We built a chip alliance to create collective strength against China, but every member is using the alliance as cover to build national strength against each other. The alliance isn't the strategy, the alliance is the alibi." That observation cuts to the heart of why this partnership is structurally failing, and it leads directly to the question that matters most for the future of semiconductor competition. If the alliance is fracturing from within, what does that actually mean for the global chip landscape over the next decade? Let me pull this together because when you see the rivals dilemma, the China revenue trap, and the subsidy cannibalization effect as a single interconnected system rather than three separate challenges, the picture becomes deeply uncomfortable for anyone who believes the current alliance framework can contain China's semiconductor ambitions. What the United States has built is not a unified technology coalition. It is a fragile arrangement of competing industrial powers held together by diplomatic pressure and short-term financial incentives, each member quietly pursuing national semiconductor sovereignty while publicly pledging collective action. Japan is protecting its equipment revenue from China while building domestic capacity to reduce dependence on Korean memory and American technology. South Korea is protecting its fab investments inside China while launching the largest national semiconductor program in history to reduce dependence on Japanese materials and American political leverage. And the United States is subsidizing foreign companies to build fabs on American soil while those same companies continue selling advanced technology to the very nation the alliance was designed to contain. I call this the alliance paradox framework. And its defining characteristic is that every action taken to strengthen the alliance simultaneously strengthens each member's incentive to operate independently of it. Here's what this actually means for the future. Let me give you 3 scenarios for how this plays out over the next decade. Scenario 1. The alliance coheres. In this scenario, the geopolitical threat from China becomes severe enough, likely through a Taiwan crisis or a major technological breakthrough, that Japan, South Korea, and the United States subordinate their commercial rivalries to genuine collective action. Export controls are harmonized and enforced without carve-outs. Subsidy programs are coordinated to avoid duplication. Revenue losses from China restrictions are offset through guaranteed intra-alliance procurement agreements. This scenario requires a level of sustained economic sacrifice and diplomatic coordination that has no precedent among commercial rivals in peacetime. The closest historical analogy is NATO's Cold War economic coordination, which took a genuine existential military threat to sustain. Without an equivalent catalyst, this scenario remains unlikely. Probability in my assessment roughly 13%. Scenario 2, the managed fragmentation. This is the scenario I consider most likely at approximately 54% probability. A semiconductor industry strategist I spoke with in San Francisco last March agreed with this assessment. In this scenario, the alliance continues to exist formally, but operates with increasingly transparent gaps between rhetoric and reality. Japan and South Korea maintain nominal compliance with export restrictions while continuously expanding the exceptions, maintenance provisions, and legacy equipment carve-outs that allow China revenue to continue flowing. Subsidy competition between alliance members intensifies. Each nation builds progressively more self-sufficient semiconductor ecosystems. The alliance becomes a diplomatic framework for managing competition rather than a genuine instrument of technology denial. China continues advancing, reaching 5 nanometer domestic capability by 2028, while alliance members quietly adjust to a world where Chinese semiconductor competitiveness is a permanent feature rather than a temporary problem. The alliance doesn't collapse, it just gradually becomes irrelevant. Scenario 3, the defection. In this scenario, one or both Asian allies explicitly prioritize China market access over alliance commitments. The trigger could be an American policy overreach, such as demanding restrictions on legacy chip sales that would devastate Samsung's and SK Hynix's China-based fabs. Or it could be a Chinese market incentive, such as offering preferential access or investment terms that make alliance compliance economically irrational. South Korea is the most likely defector given its $52.3 billion in Chinese fab assets and its 39.7% export dependency. Japan could follow if Tokyo Electron and its peers face revenue declines exceeding 20% from tightened controls. In this scenario, the alliance doesn't fragment. It ruptures, and the rupture permanently damages American credibility in future technology coalition building, probability roughly 33%. Here's my honest assessment after studying this alliance from multiple capitals, talking to policymakers in Washington, engineers in Seoul, and trade analysts in Tokyo. The Chip 4 alliance was built on a premise that commercial rivals can function as strategic partners when their fundamental economic interests diverge. History suggests they cannot, not without a binding threat so severe that it overrides every commercial calculation. And right now, that threat level, while real, is not sufficient to overcome $14.27 billion in Korean chip exports to China, $9.83 billion in Japanese equipment exports to China, and $52.3 billion in allied fab assets operating inside China. The alliance isn't failing because of Chinese strength. It's failing because of allied self-interest. And self-interest, unlike diplomatic agreements, doesn't expire, doesn't require ratification, and never takes a day off. So here's my question for you. Drop it in the comments because I read every single one. Can an alliance built on shared fears survive when its members have competing financial interests? And which scenario do you think is most likely? I genuinely want to know your perspective. If this changed how you understand the Semiconductor Alliance, subscribe and share this with someone who still believes the Chip 4 partnership is a unified front. I'll see you in the next one.